Okay, hi everyone, welcome back to the Windows Server 2016 video series. Obtaining a public authority SSL certificate. We are now pretty comfortable with grabbing certificates from our own CA server inside our own network, but what about handling those SSL certificates for our web servers that should be required from a public certification authority? For many of you, this will be the most common interaction that you have with certificates, and it's very important to understand this side of the coin as well. When you need to acquire an SSL certificate from your public authority of choice, there is a three-step process that needs to be taken. Create a certificate request, submit the certificate request, and install the certificate. We are going to use my Web1 server on which I have a website running. Currently, the site is only capable of HTTP traffic. But when I turn it loose on the internet, we need to enable HTTPS to keep the information that is being submitted onto the site encrypted. In order to use HTTPS, we need to install an SSL certificate onto the Web1 server. This web server is running the Microsoft Web Services Platform Internet Information Services, IIS. The three-step process we take is the same if you are running a different web server such as Apache, but the particular things that you have to do to accomplish these three steps will be different, because Apache or any other web server will have a different user interface than IIS. Since we are working on a Windows Server 2016 web server, we are utilizing IIS 10. Creating a certificate signing request, CSR. When you install an SSL certificate onto a web server, it is very important that the certificate and your web server share some information. The information that they share is known as a private key, and without private key information being shared between the server and the cert, your SSL certificate will be good for nothing. If your first step is acquiring an SSL certificate was to log into the CA's web server and try to purchase them immediately, download a certificate, you would have a cert that is useless to you because it cannot interact with any of your servers. So before you head into that CA website, we need to generate a CSR from our local web server that we can use when we request their certificate from the authority. Open up IIS from the Tools menu of Server Manager and then click on the name of the web server. From the navigational tree on the left side of your screen, this will populate a number of different applets into the center of the console. The one we want to work with is called Server Certificates. Go ahead and double click on that. Now inside the Server Certificate screen, you can see any existing certificates that reside on the server listed here. This is where we ultimately need to see our new SSL certificate so that we can utilize it inside our website properties when we are ready to turn on HTTPS. The first step to acquiring our new certificate is creating the certificate request to be used with our CA. And if you take a look on the right side of your screen, you will see an actions section under which is listed create certificate request. Go ahead and click on that action. In the resulting screen, you will need to populate the information that will be stored within your SSL certificate. The common name field is the most important piece of information here. It needs to be the DNS name which this certificate is going to protect. So basically, you enter the name of your website here, then continue with filling out the rest of your company-specific information. A couple of special notes here that often seem to trip up admins are that the organizational unit can be anything at all. I usually just enter the word web and then make sure to spell out the name of your state. Do not use an abbreviation. On the cryptographic service provider properties page, you typically want to leave the cryptographic services set to its default unless you have a specialized crypto card in your server and are planning to use it for handling encryption for this website. On an IIS server, you will almost always have Microsoft or SAS channel cryptographic provider listed here. What you do want to change, however, is the bit length. The standard bit length for many years was 1024, and that continues to be the default choice in Windows Server 2016. The general industry of SSL encryption, though, has decided that 1024 is too weak and the new standard is 2048. When you head onto your CA's website to request a certificate, you will more than likely find that your request needs to have a minimum of 2048 bits. So go ahead and change that drop-down setting to 2048. The only thing left to do for our CSR is to give it a location and file name. Saving this CSR as a text file is the normal way to go and serves our purpose, as well as we need to do when we request our certificate is open the file and copy and paste the contents. You have now created your certificate signing request CSR file, and we can utilize this file to request the certificate from our public CA. Submitting the certificate request. Next step, head on over to the website for your public certification authority. Again, any of those companies that we mentioned earlier, such as GoDaddy or VeriSign, are appropriate for this purpose. Each authority has its own look and feel for their web interface, so I cannot give you exact steps that need to be taken for this process. Once you have an account and log into the authority's site, you should be able to find an option for purchasing an SSL certificate. Once that certificate has been purchased, there will be a process for requesting and deploying that certificate. Once you enter the interface for building your new certificate, generally the only piece of information that the CA will ask you for is the contents of the CSR file. If you open up a text file we saved earlier, this mess of data is exactly what the CA needs in order to create your new SSL certificate, so that it shares private key info with the web server from which the CSR was generated and will interact appropriately with IIS. Typically, all you need to do is copy the entire contents of the CSR file and paste them into the CA's website. Downloading and installing your certificate. Now you wait, depending on which authority you are using and also depending on how often your company purchases certificates from this authority. Your certificate might be available for download almost immediately, or it could take a few hours before that certificate shows up in the available downloads list. The reason for this is that many of the CAs utilize human approval for new certificates, and you are literally waiting for someone to put eyes on the certificate and your information to make sure you really work for the company, that you really own this domain name. Remember, the real benefit to a public SSL cert is that the CA is guaranteeing that the user of this certificate is the real deal. So they want to make sure they aren't issuing a certificate for portal.contoso.com to someone in the Fabricium organization by mistake. Once you are able to download the certificate from the CA website, go ahead and copy it over to the web server from which we generated the CSR. It is critically important that you install this new certificate onto the same server. If you were to install this new certificate onto a different web server, one that I did not guarantee the CSR, this certificate was built from, that certificate would import successfully, but would not be able to function. Back inside the IIS Management Console, we can now use the action in that list on the right called Complete Certificate Request. This launches a short little wizard in which you find a new certificate file that you just downloaded and import it into our server. Now that the certificate resides on the server, it is ready to be used by your website. There is one additional item that I always check after installing or importing an SSL certificate. You can now see your new certificate listed inside IIS, and if you double click on your new certificate, you will see the properties page on the cert. On the general tab of these properties, take a look near the bottom. Your certificate should display a little key icon and text. You have a private key that corresponds to this certificate. If you can see this message, it means your import was successful and that the new certificate file matched up with the CSR perfectly. The server and the certificate now share that critical information, and the SSL certificate will be able to work properly to protect our website. If you do not see this message, it means that something in the process to request and download our certificate went wrong. If you do not see the message here, you need to start over with generating a new CSR, because the certificate file that you got back must not have been keyed appropriately against that CSR or something along those lines. Without the text at the bottom of this screen, your certificate will not validate traffic properly. Here is an example of what it should look like when working correctly. Exporting and importing certificates. I often find myself needing to use the same SSL certificate on multiple servers. This might happen in the case where I have more than one IIS server serving up the same website, and I am using some form of load balancing to split the traffic between them. This need may also arise when working with any form of hardware load balancer, as you sometimes need to import certificates onto not only the web servers themselves, but also into the load balancer box. Yet another example is when using wildcard certificates. When you purchase a wildcard, you typically have the intention of installing it onto multiple servers. Does this mean that I need to generate a new CSR from each server and request a new copy of the same certificate multiple times? Definitely not. And in fact, doing so could cause you other problems. You see, when a public CA rekeys a certificate, or in other words, if you have already requested a certificate with particular name and then come back again later to request another copy of the same certificate, that CA may invalidate the first one as it uses the second copy. This is not always immediately apparent, and there is usually a timer set on the invalidation of the first certificate. If you revisit the CA's web interface and request a new copy of the same certificate using a new CSR for your second web server, you might discover that everything works fine for a few days, but then suddenly the primary web server stops validating traffic because its SSL certificate expired. What to do then? When you have the need for reusing the same SSL certificate on multiple servers, you can simply export it from one and import it on the next. This process is quite straightforward, and there are two common places from where you can do it: inside either the MMC Snap in for certificates or from within IIS itself. You have this capability. It is important to note, though, that the process is slightly different depending on which avenue you take, and you have to be especially aware of what is happening with the private key as you step through these wizards. Exporting from MMC, head back into your local computer certificate store in the MMC and navigate to Personal Certificates so that you can see your SSL certificate listed. Right-click on the certificate and then navigate to All Tasks Export. When you walk through this export wizard, the important part that I wanted to mention happens right away in the wizard steps. The first choice you have to make is whether or not to export the private key. Again, the private key is the secret sauce that allows the certificate to interact properly with the server on which it is installed. If you export without the private key, that certificate will not work on another server. So it is important here that if you are exporting this certificate with the intention of installing it onto a second web server and using it for validating SSL traffic, that you do select the top option for yes, export the private key. As the wizard sufficiently warns, when you choose to export a certificate containing the private key information, you are required to supply a password which will be used to protect the exported PFX file. It is important to choose a good password here. If you forget it, your exported file will be completely useless. If you input a password that is very simple or easy to guess, then anyone who gets their hands on this PFX file may be able to use your certificate on their own web servers. That could definitely turn out badly. Exporting from IIS. Inside the server certificates applet for IIS, all you need to do is right-click on the certificate and choose Export. This launches a single-page wizard that simply asks you for a location and password. We may have more options that we could have chosen or denied when we exported using MMC. So why is this so short? IIS makes assumptions for the rest of the settings in order to speed up the export process. When you are exporting an SSL certificate, chances are that you do intend to export the private key also, and that you are going to take the default rest of the settings anyway. So IIS simply bypasses all of those choices. You are forced to enter a password because You don't have a choice about the private key. It will be included with the certificate export automatically. So if you had some reason to export a certificate that did not contain the private key info, then you could not utilize the IIS console for this task. You would need to open up MMC and walk through the more extensive wizard found here, importing onto a second server, whichever direction you take for accomplishing the export. Once you have finally fleshed PFX file available, importing onto your second server is very easy from within either console, MMC or IIS. You can right click and choose the import action. Walking through the steps, you simply choose the PFX file and then input the password that you need to protect the file. The certificate then imports, and if you open the properties, you will see that the little key icon and private key message are displayed properly at the bottom of the screen. Go ahead and try it for yourself. Find a server with an SSL certificate and test exporting that cert with and without the private key. When you import onto a new server, you will see that importing the certificate file without a private key does not contain this message at the bottom of the properties page, but the export file that does contain the private key results in the proper message here. To take it a step further, try utilizing both certificates on a non-important website and see what happens. You will find that the certificate lacking the private key will fail to validate the SSL traffic summary. Certificates often get a bad rap, and I believe this is because people think they are a headache to deal with. I see their point. Without knowing how to navigate through the various administrative consoles that deal with your certificate infrastructure, it would be difficult to make even the simplest items function. By talking through the most common certificate-related tasks that any server admin will eventually have to tackle within their own networks, I hope that you have found some comfortability and confidence now to progress with those projects which might be currently sitting on hold, waiting for the certificate infrastructure to be built. So I'm going to leave it here today for this video. If you like listening, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. Thank you.